Effective immediately, your position at Reyes Biotech has been terminated. HR will contact you regarding your final paperwork. That was the entire text message, sent at 9:14 in the morning on the 12-year anniversary of our wedding, from the man who was still, legally, my husband. I read it standing in our kitchen, coffee in hand, wearing the bracelet he'd given me that same morning before he left for the office. And I felt something inside me go very quiet and very still. He had no idea what he'd just done. Not to our marriage. He'd clearly already decided that was over. To the company itself. But to understand why a single text message could unravel a $400 million biotech company in 11 days, you need to know something Marcus never fully understood about the work I actually did there. My name is Dr. Elena Marsh. I kept my maiden name professionally throughout our marriage, a decision that turned out to matter far more than either of us realized at the time we made it. I met Marcus Reyes 14 years ago, back when I was finishing my postdoctoral research in protein engineering, and he was an ambitious, charismatic business graduate looking to build something. In biotech, without any scientific background of his own, we fell in love the way people do when they're young, and building something together feels indistinguishable from building a life together. 2 years into dating, I developed a novel enzyme stabilization process in my own independent lab before we were married, before Reyes Biotech existed in any real form. I filed the patent myself under my own name, using savings from a research grant because at the time, it was simply my work, done independently, with no employer or company attached to it at all. We married a year later. Marcus, with genuine enthusiasm and what I believed then was genuine partnership, proposed building a company around my patented process. I licensed the technology to Reyes Biotech exclusively. The moment we incorporated, a licensing agreement drafted quickly, informally by a lawyer friend of Marcus's, back when we were newlyweds who trusted each other completely and saw no need for adversarial contract language between spouses building something together. That licensing agreement is the detail Marcus forgot entirely existed 12 years later. The morning he fired me by text message. For the first several years, our marriage and our company were genuinely happily intertwined. I ran the science. Marcus ran the business and the fundraising, which he was undeniably talented at. We built Reyes Biotech from a 2-person operation into a company employing almost 200 people, built entirely around the enzyme stabilization platform my original patent made possible. I want to be honest that somewhere around year 8, something shifted. Marcus began describing the company's origins in interviews and investor pitches in ways that quietly minimized my role, the same way ambitious founders sometimes do when they start believing their own mythology. "I built this from an idea I had," he told one journalist. In an interview I happened to read the morning it published, with no mention of the underlying science or the person who'd actually developed it. I didn't correct him publicly. I told myself it didn't matter, that the marriage and the partnership underneath it were still solid, even if the public story had started drifting from the truth. The drift didn't stay contained to interviews. Over the following 4 years, I noticed Marcus increasingly excluding me from strategic conversations about the company's future. Conversations that used to happen naturally between us over dinner, now happening instead in closed-door meetings I only heard about afterward. I told myself this was simply the natural evolution of a growing company, that Marcus needed executives besides his wife, that it wasn't personal. I want to be honest about the moment I started genuinely worrying, because it matters for what comes later. 18 months before the anniversary text, I noticed Marcus had begun spending significant time with a new chief strategy officer he'd recently hired. A sharp, ambitious woman named Vanessa Cole, who had previously worked at one of our largest competitors before joining us. Their working relationship felt, gradually, less like a business partnership and more like something else entirely. Though I told myself repeatedly I was imagining things, the way people often do when the alternative is too painful to fully consider. 3 months before that text message, Marcus asked me, almost casually over dinner, whether the original licensing agreement between me and the company could be modernized and simplified as part of preparing for a potential acquisition offer he said the board was fielding. He framed it as routine legal housekeeping. I agreed to have my own attorney review it, mostly out of habit, since by that point in our marriage, a quiet professional caution had become simply how I operated, even with my own husband. My attorney found something in the proposed new agreement that Marcus's team had drafted, something I don't think Marcus himself fully understood, buried as it was in dense licensing language. The new agreement would have converted my exclusive license into a fully assignable, perpetual, royalty-free transfer of the patent to the company itself, permanently severing my personal ownership entirely, in exchange for a modest one-time payment far below the technology's actual value. I declined to sign it. Marcus seemed frustrated but didn't push further at the time. I didn't yet understand why that particular change mattered so urgently to him. I understand now, looking back, that the timeline of what happened next wasn't coincidental. 2 months after I declined to sign the new agreement, Marcus began quietly meeting with representatives from Halden Pharmaceuticals, one of our largest competitors, the same company Vanessa Cole had worked for before joining us. I didn't know about these meetings at the time. I found out only afterward, through documents my attorney and I later obtained during the dispute that followed the firing. What I've since pieced together, through documented evidence rather than assumption, is this. Halden Pharmaceuticals had approached Marcus with an acquisition offer for Reyes Biotech, but specifically, an offer contingent on the company holding full, unencumbered ownership of the enzyme stabilization patent, my patent, free of any personal licensing arrangement that could complicate the sale or give me, personally, ongoing leverage or royalties independent of the company's ownership structure. Marcus, it appears, had quietly decided that removing me from the company entirely and separately pressuring me through the divorce process to sign over the patent as part of a settlement was a faster path to closing that acquisition than continuing to negotiate with his own wife as an equal, independent patent holder. I want to be honest about something here. I don't believe even now that Vanessa Cole was purely a romantic entanglement in the way I initially assumed. The evidence my attorney and I gathered afterward suggests something more calculated. Vanessa had maintained ongoing contact with Halden Pharmaceuticals throughout her employment at Reyes Biotech, and appears to have specifically encouraged Marcus, over many months, toward exactly the acquisition path that would have required stripping my patent rights entirely. Whether Marcus fully understood he was being maneuvered, or whether he simply found it convenient to be maneuvered in a direction that also let him end our marriage on his own terms, I genuinely don't know, and I'm not certain it matters as much as what he actually did. What I do know is that the text message firing me, sent on our anniversary, arrived the same morning Marcus's team finalized a term sheet with Halden Pharmaceuticals. A term sheet that assumed, incorrectly, that my termination as an employee would somehow also resolve the separate, personal patent licensing agreement that had nothing legally to do with my employment status at all. Here is the detail Marcus's lawyers apparently missed. Buried in an agreement drafted 12 years earlier by a trusted friend, back when nobody involved anticipated needing airtight adversarial language between two people who loved each other. My license to Reyes Biotech was tied explicitly to my status as the patent holder, not my employment. Terminating my employment did absolutely nothing to the licensing agreement itself. But the agreement did contain one clause that mattered enormously in this specific situation, a standard change of control provision, stating that if the company underwent a fundamental ownership change, such as an acquisition, my exclusive license would require formal renegotiation and my explicit written consent before transferring to any new parent entity. Marcus, and apparently Halden Pharmaceuticals' own legal team, had been operating under the assumption that firing me would simplify the acquisition. Instead, it meant the person whose consent they now legally needed to complete the acquisition at all had just been served formal termination papers by text message on her wedding anniversary, with no advance conversation, no negotiation, and, as it turned out, no remaining goodwill whatsoever to grant that consent easily. I didn't respond to the text message that morning. I called my attorney instead. Within 11 days, the Halden Pharmaceuticals acquisition, which Marcus's board had been quietly counting on to secure the company's future, and, I later learned, to personally enrich several board members, including Marcus himself, through change of control bonuses, was formally frozen. My attorney sent notice that any acquisition proceeding, without my explicit consent as licensed patent holder, would constitute a material breach entitling me to seek immediate injunctive relief and full damages. Halden Pharmaceuticals' legal team, understandably unwilling to close a $400 million acquisition with active, unresolved intellectual property litigation hanging over the company's core technology, paused the deal entirely within the same week. Marcus called me repeatedly over the following days. I want to be honest that I let most of those calls go to voicemail. Not out of strategy, but because I genuinely didn't yet know what I wanted to say to a man who had ended 12 years of marriage over text message. On the one day of the year we'd always specifically protected for each other. When I finally did speak with him, through our respective attorneys rather than directly, the conversation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about the practical unwinding of a marriage and a business that had become, over 14 years, almost impossible to separate from each other. Marcus's board, once they understood the actual legal exposure he'd created by mishandling both the licensing agreement and my termination simultaneously, was considerably less sympathetic to him than he apparently expected. The eventual settlement, negotiated over the following months, restructured the licensing agreement in my favor rather than dissolving it. I retained full ownership of the original patent, along with a substantially increased royalty rate, reflecting the technology's actual proven value. Now that Reyes Biotech's own revenue history made clear exactly how essential it had been from the beginning. The divorce settlement, negotiated separately but around the same table, reflected 14 years of shared contribution, rather than the quick, one-sided severance Marcus had apparently hoped a hostile firing might produce. Reyes Biotech eventually did complete an acquisition, though not with Halden Pharmaceuticals, and not on the terms Marcus had originally negotiated. A different acquirer, willing to properly license the technology directly from me at fair value, closed a deal that ultimately protected far more of the company's 200 employees' jobs than Marcus's original arrangement would have. I don't know what became of Marcus's relationship with Vanessa Cole, and I've made a genuine effort not to spend much time wondering. I know that the board eventually asked Marcus to step down as CEO within a year of the settlement. Once the full picture of how the acquisition had been mishandled became clear to everyone involved. I still hold the patent. I still work in protein engineering, now through my own independent lab, licensing my ongoing research to multiple companies rather than a single one, built around a marriage that turned out to matter less to my former husband than a faster path to an acquisition. Bonus. I think about that morning often, not with the devastation I felt reading that text message standing in our kitchen, but with a strange, steady gratitude that 14 years earlier, a much younger version of me had quietly, carefully filed a patent under her own name, simply because at the time, it was simply her own work. If you've made it this far with me, do you think Marcus fully understood what Vanessa was steering him toward? Or do you think he was just as much a victim of his own ambition as anyone else in this story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning.